Hi everybody. Just wanted to create a quick demo to address some of the questions I've been getting lately, specifically around how best to move geometry from InfraWorks 360 into some of the other packages that exist within the Autodesk Infrastructure Design Suites, specifically around Civil 3D, 3ds Max, AutoCAD, Navisworks, and the like. We have some tools already that will help us facilitate the transfer of that data, but what I want to do is show you some other workflows that maybe we can transfer over some information that we're not able to do through those automated tools. So to look at this in the demonstration, I've got a model here that I created with Model Builder. It is between the Illinois and Iowa borders, the Mississippi River that separates them. The project we want to look at is perhaps a new bridge that's going to connect these two roads. So what I'm going to do is I've already created my bridge, so we'll just bring that up quickly here. The bridge was created using the bridge design for InfraWorks 360 tools. So my bridge is in and I'm ready to go. And if I look at, I've also created a couple of buildings here on a property adjacent to the bridge. So what I have, I'd like to bring this across. There are tools within Civil 3D that will help us facilitate this process. If we go over to Civil 3D, there is a tool here that I can select, insert, and then connect to InfraWorks 360 and then bring some data over. That'll include planning roads, design roads, it'll include the bridge, my surfaces, some pipes and other things. But it doesn't include things like buildings and actually the detailed bridge that maybe I'd like to use for other purposes. So the data that I do get is very good. I've got the existing ground surface and the bridge in this case. Let me show you what I do get. The bridge works for the intended purpose of showing me a representation of the bridge that I started with. I can also then take this bridge and put it in my profile so that I can, view it with respect to the vertical elevation information. But the bridge has been kind of stripped of a lot of the detail that was available in InfraWorks 360. And I've had some folks that have asked, hey, is there any way to get that detailed bridge from InfraWorks 360 into this environment or maybe into some of our other tools? And the short answer to that question is yes, and we'll take a quick look at that. If I come over and look at the bridge that I created in InfraWorks 360, I can see that it includes things like, the guardrails. I've got a barrier in the middle between the divided highway. I've got chain link fence and street lights and a lot more information than what we get in the traditional transfer. So I'd like to take a look at that. Also the some of the materials. If I come down here and we'll take a look at the buildings area, I've got some buildings as well. I'd like to move those buildings or make those buildings available in my other applications. So what I'm going to do, I'd like to get the most realistic or most detailed version of those buildings possible. So I'm going to go to Settings and Utilities, and I'm going to change my model generation for my building facades to high. Then after I do that, I'll hit F5 to regenerate my model. Now I've only got a couple buildings in here, so this process won't take very long. If I had a lot of buildings, it would take substantially longer for it to, represent them in that higher level of detail. I'm only going to need this for a minute so that I can export it, and that is why I saved a bookmark to go back to the buildings. So we can see that the higher level of detail buildings have inset windows. There is some ornamentation or detail that's available on the tops of the buildings, maybe some balconies or stairs or other things that have been created. First thing I want to do is we'll take a look at what it is involved in just moving the buildings into, say, Civil 3D if we wanted to show them there. So what I'm going to do is we'll come up and we'll export 3D model is the tool that we'll use to accomplish this. When we go into that, I'm going to use a polygon and I'm going to pick points. Now notice when I pick my points from a polygon, you can see the coordinates that I'm working in. Currently it's a form of state plane, so it's about 2.25 million by 1.8 million. This happens to be Illinois state plane west zone US feet because it's at the border of Illinois and Iowa. We'll double pick when complete. What I want to do as far as my coordinates, we'll use user define, that I'm going to set these to 0 so that it doesn't include any offset. Typically, if we're going to take this into another environment, having coordinates up in the millions can be problematic, so the other options will give us a export that has coordinates that are much lower. In this case, we'll set it to 0, 0 because I need it to fall into Civil 3D into its appropriate place. So we'll look at multiple files first. The only thing I'm interested in exporting is the buildings. I'm going to export those to my desktop, and we'll just call it buildings.fbx. We'll save and then export. And then we'll come back and we'll look at that in Civil 3D. From here, I want to bring those in. So we'll say insert, and then we'll import. And using the FBX file, we'll come down and grab FBX buildings. We'll say open. I want to set my units so that they're 1-to-1, so there's no scaling or anything like that. I am going to turn off lights and cameras. There aren't any anyway, but I'm really only interested in the objects and the materials. In this case, we'll see that we'll get nice buildings, but the materials won't come across. We'll step up and do that in a second. As far as layer, we'll just put them on a new layer buildings for right now. We click OK. We'll let that process for just a moment, and our buildings will be displayed and should pop into our area here adjacent to the bridge. All right, and my buildings have come in. If we zoom up and just select the buildings in my surface here, we'll take a look at it in the object viewer here very quickly. View those buildings. We'll pan over, and we see that the buildings themselves that have been created are of that same level of detail that we had before. Now the thing is, it brought the buildings over. We have that high level of detail, but we don't necessarily have all of the materials. You know, we go back and think, well, hey, I had materials on the buildings that were in InfraWorks 360. Is there any way that I could get those packaged up and then available into this environment as well? And there is. So what I'm going to do is we'll back up a couple of steps here to where the buildings are out. We'll hop back in InfraWorks 360, and what I'm going to do is this time I'm not only interested in the buildings, but I'd also maybe like to grab the bridge as well, because we'd like to get both and represent the higher level of detail bridge at the same time. So we'll back up. To be able to accomplish that, what we're going to do is export 3D model once again. Polygon. We'll come up and around. And by selecting this, what InfraWorks 360 will do is package up and export everything that falls within this boundary. So we'll make sure I have all the data that I'm interested in. We'll use the same user-defined coordinates of 0, 0, and 0. And in this case, we could do multiple files again. We could do ground and buildings. I'm going to go ahead and we'll put it all in a single file because I'm going to run this through Navisworks and then perform an export there, and then that will assist me in the process of maintaining those materials. So we'll go ahead and export this data. It'll take a moment to export that. It's going to go into my documents folder as im_export.fbx. Could have pointed that to a different folder, probably should have, but that's okay. We'll remember where it is. So I'm going to flip over now to Navisworks, and what we're going to do is I'm going to append to my file off my documents the im_export.fbx. We'll give that a moment to bring that in. And what we should see is our building as well as our bridge. When it comes in, not sure where we're looking in space, so I'm going to click my view to change to that perspective. And then once I come in, as I zoom in and out, I can see I've got a very nice representation of my buildings with materials. I've also got like some existing ground and some other data that I probably don't need because that's already been represented in my Civil 3D model. So what I'm going to do, first thing, is I'm just going to start selecting some of those areas that I don't need. We'll just hide those representations for right now. I'm going to grab the surface specifically. I'm not going to take the time to, clean out maybe some of the other roads and that I don't need. We'll just take the excess for right now, and then we'll grab this one out here on the end. We'll take him off. So I'm happy with the data that I have left. Now, the one thing that I need to do is I need to make sure that this is in the correct coordinate system and things are the appropriate size. So we could find out if it's the correct size if we come in and start to perform a measurement. For example, on our building, we would expect it to be roughly 50 foot across. In this case, it's 1.662. So it's not the right size. So what we need to remember to do is when we bring this in, I'm going to highlight the file, and then I'm going to come down to Units and Transformation, and I'm going to convert it from centimeters to feet. In doing so, that will scale it up and get it not only to the appropriate size, but on the appropriate coordinate system. If we were to measure the building now, we should see, if I remember correctly, that this is around 50 feet across here. Yeah, all right, and it is, so we're in good shape. So I've got my data on the right coordinate system as well as the right geometry we want to work with. So I'm going to take this and export it, my current model, as an FBX file. We've got a similar dialog, a little bit different to what we had before. I'm going to use the textures, not worry about lights and cameras. We'll embed any of the materials in here. Units and all that look good. We'll take the defaults for that. And what we're going to do is we'll say OK. And I'm going to put that on my desktop, and we'll call it Bridge-Buildings. We'll say Save. And now we can come out back into the Civil 3D world. And let's do this. I'm going to grab the bridge that we started with, and I'm just going to hide that so that that's out. And we will do the same thing with this smaller bridge that was over here, over the creek. So we'll hide that one as well. And we'll import now from the desktop our bridge and buildings. We'll say open. Same thing as before. We'll set the units to 1 and 1. New layer, bridge buildings, objects, materials. That's good. We'll say OK. And we'll give that a moment to churn and bring in our geometry. All right, and our geometries come in. What I'm going to do now is just to confirm some of this. We will, window my building here just very quickly. Take a look at it in the object viewer. We'll see that if we view it and we'll turn it into realistic, when that comes in, my building has the materials in that applied to it. So I've successfully brought that in. At the same time, if we come over and maybe grab our bridge, grab across here, we'll take a look at that in the object viewer. And if we look at that again, maybe from a side view, we'll pan. Oh, didn't grab the bridge piers. Let's just do this. We'll change my perspective, and so we're viewing it from that corner. And if we come up and look at our geometry, I'm just going to do a realistic. And I can see I've got a much better representation of my bridge. I've got not only the fence, I've got my light posts, I've got the guardrails, my bridge piers, and if I were to back up, we'll go over, since we've gone this far, we'll come over and check out the buildings as well. So all of our buildings are there, and they're also using the materials that were exported from InfraWorks 360. Okay, those are supported directly as well through a render. We can do some rendering on the Civil 3D side. So if we get a little closer to this guy and we just perform a quick render, we should see some of those materials display in the viewport for us. All right, so as that continues to clean up, we see those objects. So we were able to take the detailed bridge and the buildings and bring them into the Civil 3D environment, while at the same time maintain the materials that were used in the creation of those. The next question that I typically get is, there are tools within Civil 3D that we can begin to move some of this information into 3ds Max. So we can create some photorealistic renderings and animations. So I'm going to switch this back to 2D wireframe. Let's take a look at that for a minute. The way that we would take it out typically is if we would go into the Output tab. There is a tool here that we could say export to 3ds Max, and then we would get a list of things that we could export. That would allow us to export corridor models and surfaces and some geometry from the corridor, our alignment, and other feature lines that we could use to construct that in 3ds Max. However, once we do that, much like moving from InfraWorks 360, I don't necessarily have tools that are directly related to the bridge or other things from this environment to move over. One other thing that we need to be aware of, if I switch over to Max, I've moved some of this data already into this environment using Civil View. I've added a daylight system, as well as I created a plane for my water. I've got my surface information here. We'll go to a perspective view. I've got my surface in here so that if I start to look at it from different directions, we can see my terrain in that, but I don't have the bridge available to me just yet. And while I could create that through Civil View, there are some tools that would help facilitate that. If I've already created that bridge in InfraWorks 360, I'd really like to use it in here. So let's take a look at the process of what we would use to do that. Now, I'd love to be able to make a direct link to that file for us to be able to use it, but when we brought the data over from Civil 3D, what it does is it applies an offset to the geometry in 3ds Max so that we're not working in coordinates that are up in the millions. So the key that we need to know is what shift has been applied to this geometry when it was brought in. And if we come to the Civil View Explorer and we go to Scene Settings, we see those values are right there, 224, 2464, and then negative 181. All right, so basically it's moving at a quarter of a million in the X direction, and then a million 8 in the Y direction to get the geometry from these, really large coordinates down closer to 0, 0, where 3ds Max is more comfortable working with it. So, but the good news is we're able to deal with that fairly easily. We just need to apply the shift. So if I go to Navisworks, I've already done the heavy lifting to get my geometry in here. If I select my file, right-click, I can come down to Units and Transformation. We've already got it at the appropriate coordinate system and units. Here's where I can apply that shift. So I'm going to, because I didn't write it down, we're going to make this so that I can see both values at the same time. We'll move this up so that we see the value down here. I'm going to go to Units and Transform, and the values that I'm going to use are going to be negative 224, 2464, and we're going to use the other value negative 1811929, and we'll say OK. When we do, our model disappears because it's now moved much closer to the origin. I can come back and review that from that display, and now I've got a representation of our geometry shifted consistent with what 3ds Max is currently looking for. So we're going to export that again. We'll say export FBX. We're going to use the same values we did before. I'm going to export that to my desktop, and in this case we're just going to call this bridge building, and then I'm going to say shift just so that we know the difference. We'll say save. It's going to create that for us. Now, if you are a 3ds Max person and you know how to link directly to an FBX file, you're basically done. We'll leave that open for right now. We'll minimize that just in case we were to need to come back to it. You could import that FBX file directly into here, set the appropriate values, and it'll lay in exactly where it's supposed to. I'm not a 3ds Max person, so I need the process to be a bit more automated than that because that's not my background. Fortunately for us, within the Infrastructure Design Suite is AutoCAD, and there are tools that will help us facilitate that from within here. So I'm going to come down and we're going to say from within AutoCAD, import from my desktop I'm going to come down and we'll grab the bridge building shift. Let's see, my units are currently set to inches. Let's cancel out of that. I want my units set to feet. So we'll set those to feet. And then we'll do that again. Import bridge building shift. We're going to set this 1 and 1. Objects, materials, all of that looks good. We'll say OK. Bring that in much the same way that we did in Civil 3D. So we'll let this churn here for a moment and get our geometry displayed and in the appropriate location that we can make the final move into 3ds Max. All right, with our geometry in, once again, it could be anywhere, so we're going to zoom extents so that we can find it. There is our geometry. If I move my mouse around, it's in coordinates around 4,000 or 2,000. That's consistent with what I would expect in my 3ds Max as a result of the shift from the state plane coordinates. If we flip our display over to realistic, we should see that I still have my materials in that, and I do, so that looks good. Let's do this. The reason I came back to AutoCAD is, once again, I'm not a 3ds Max person, but there is a fantastic tool in here for suites workflow. 5 of them have been set up specific for 3ds Max. There's one here that I'm going to use, 3ds Max Design. It could also be 3ds Max for a building model. So we're going to go ahead and select that. We're going to go ahead and run it. And we're going to move that into my active 3ds Max session. So that's the drawing that I'm currently in right now. So we will select that. And what it's going to do is it's going to link to this file, which is great because then if I wanted to update the file and redisplay it, I could do that, which does remind me I'm going to cancel out of this for just a second. We've never saved it so that it's got the name drawing 1. So we all know that if we don't save it, it's as if it was never really there. So we'll go ahead and save this file on my desktop for right now. We won't necessarily worry about organizing it as a project or whatever. We'll just call this detailed model. All right, for my bridge in that, we'll save, and then we'll perform that linking operation. So we'll do rendering. We'll run that. This is going to be a active 3ds Max session. We're going to link it into here. We'll hit continue. It's going to automatically transfer that and be ready to go. Once again, if we didn't save, it still would have worked, but what it would have done is it would have linked to basically the template that was used for AutoCAD here, or AutoCAD DWT, so it would have been blank. So it's telling us that it's been completed. There's a file link manager in 3ds Max. We can refer to that, adjust settings accordingly, or remove it in the future. We'll go ahead and close out of that, and if we look, we now see that our bridge is shown in 3ds Max, and it is as our buildings. So if I come into here and we'll take a look at a perspective view, and we start to alter our display here, we'll see our buildings over on the shore, as well as our bridge. And some of that may be displayed now primarily in a view that looks white. As we saw before, the materials are there, but the materials themselves may not show up until the point that we do a render. So with this, let's go ahead and test our handiwork by creating a render of that area. You see one of the last ones that I did prior to bringing the bridge in. Let's go ahead and render this. It'll create a new one for us. And as that's currently refined on the screen, we can see in 3ds Max the detail for our InfraWorks 360 bridge now being represented within our 3ds model. We see our buildings over on the shore, and as it continues to render, we see the detail of our bridge having been completed for us with the fences and the street lights and other geometry. All right, so with that completed, what have we accomplished? We've basically taken a project that started in InfraWorks 360 where we created a conceptual bridge. laid that out to show the representation of our project. Perhaps that was then moved into Civil 3D, where we could start to refine or look at some final design, or just wanted to be able to refer to the more detailed graphics in this environment. So we looked that we could bring in realistic looking 3D buildings with all of the detail that exists in InfraWorks 360, not only the buildings themselves, but also the buildings with the materials, as well as the materials and the detail representing our bridge. From there, we were able to leverage that same data in 3ds Max so that we could create renderings or leverage further the civil view tools in here to start driving cars across the bridge or creating other animations that we would like to use as part of our project. At the same time, we've seen a workflow that allows us to go essentially, back and forth. We could export data from here as FBX and start to move it back into InfraWorks 360 or into AutoCAD or Navisworks or Civil 3D or any of the other applications that we touched as part of this demonstration. So with that, I hope it was helpful, and thank you for watching.